Alors, rebonjour et bon après-midi. Bienvenue à ceux et celles qui viennent de se joindre à nous pour cette classe des maîtres en culture et créativité. Nous sommes à MTL Connect. We are at MTL Connect, Montreal's Digital Week. And thank you for being here for this Masterclass in Culture and Creativity. Mon nom est Armand Camille, votre animateur de chez Kelvin Zero. Je suis avec vous depuis le début de MTL Connect et ça va me faire plaisir d'être ici jusqu'à jeudi soir où on termine les activités ici aux 7 doigts de la main. Alors, sans plus tarder, j'aimerais dès maintenant vous présenter votre prochain invité qui va vous présenter cette classe des maîtres. And I'm looking forward to introduce the next speaker who will be presenting her masterclass on cross-species sociality, centering reciprocity in research-création. Alors, notre prochaine classe des maîtres est basée sur la socialité interespèce, centrée sur la réciprocité dans la recherche et la création. Alors, je vous présente sans plus tarder Dr.Miranda Smitheram. She's a designer, researcher, artist, educator from Aotearoa, New Zealand. She's also an assistant professor of material futures and the co-director of textiles and materiality at Research Cluster. Please welcome Miranda Smitheram.
Oh, sorry. Kia ora koutou, hello and welcome to all. I was thinking backstage that it feels like a very big space to be standing in all by yourself, especially with this echoey mic. But I'm not standing by myself. I'm actually standing here representing my collaborators and co-creators today. So I'll introduce and situate the talk by beginning with them. So I already had a lovely introduction to who I am as a human being, but my more than human collaborators that I work with include the flora and fauna and phenomena of Kerikeri Beach in the Waitakere Ranges, Auckland, New Zealand, which is under the mana whenua or customary leadership of Te Kawaro Amaki. I also work with the flora of Île Saint-Hélène here in Jojoki, Montreal, which is unceded territory of Kanien'kehá:ka. I've worked with the flora and sea life of Tamaki Estuary and Tamaki Makaurau in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the mana whenua or the customary caretakers of that space is Ngāti Whātua. And finally, I work with Ka Tiritiri o Te Moana, Te Waipunamu and Pikiwhara, both in the South Island of New Zealand and under the mana whenua of my tribal affiliations, Kaitahu. So as a scholar and artist, my background is in fashion and textiles. My training came through design and later philosophy. And somewhere along the way, my practice expanded or contracted, I'm not really sure which, into materialities and surfaces, particularly the ontologies and aesthetics of materiality across the spaces of digital, virtual, and physical. So for the past 5 years, my research pathway has taken me into this deeper examination of materiality by tracing back to matter itself. And in that, there was a sense of sort of returning to my own instinctive first encounters with the world as a child through haptic and tactile explorations. And a real sense of feeling that I'm working backwards to move forwards. I describe my research creation process as kinship assemblages, co-creation through more than human material ecologies. These research explorations have centered largely around place, working with very specific places, and unfolding through the knowledge forming of the socio-cultural dimensionality, the histories, the potentiality, and the way of being in the world of particular flora or natural phenomena found in those places. So my process has been really deeply informed by my training in and exposure to Mātauranga Māori, which is a particular knowledge, forms of knowledge and ways of knowing from my own hybrid culture of Māori and Pākehā background and worldview. Over time, my process has adapted and refined, and I've been starting to sort of reflect upon and think about how my own frameworks of approach have formed in collaboration with the non-human through matter flows and crystallizing into modes of working within ecosystems. Working and creating in these active collaborations with matter, such as wind and tidal currents, water flows, I've gradually come to appreciate that the process itself and the reciprocity of the experience are the primary outcomes of the research for me, rather than the tangible or pragmatic outcomes of a new material, a new artwork, or a new biocomposite material. So I started sort of thinking about how to sort of formalize these experiences across this multiplicity of projects in the past 5 years, all centered in ecosystem research. And I was thinking about how we need to actively foster a new relationship with nature and other species, one in which the legacy of industrial modernity, the careless and fast warp speed we attach to both experience, satisfaction, product consumption, control and mastery over nature and place, progress, stasis or staticness valued as perfection, is thrown aside, and we instead embrace our ecosystemic interdependency and reciprocal existence. This requires us to really shift our relationship with Earth and to remake ourselves. And today I'll propose and share a new framework for research creation of making with, collaborating with nature, or the more than human, that proposes a rethink of approach through ethics, through processes, through expectations, and through aesthetics. As a counterpoint to the dualisms of nature-culture divides, the concept of more than human refers to the worlds of different beings co-dwelling on the earth, including and surpassing human bodies, human societies. More than human refers to contexts in which multiple species and processes come together to produce a result. From design of artifacts, built environments and systems, to the production, use and end of life of things, materiality is a really urgent and critical issue for technical, scientific, sociocultural and political considerations of sustainability or unsustainability. Far from being a really simple task to solve or a one sort of stop kind of solution, thinking through unsustainable matter means to appreciate the contradictory implications that come along with the co-creation of what we've made now as uninhabitable landscapes, and the consequences of design practices that result in vast amounts of materials that contribute to ecosystem destruction and pose threat to other humans and other beings on the planet. So most of us are really aware of the 20th century leaving us with this design heritage and burden of a world populated by things and the actions of humans being and doing at the expense of non-humans, with the byproducts of industrial societies, consumption and consequent disposal and pollution. Parallel and inexplicably entwined with this is the inequality of design justice, the implications of these processes of production and consumption and disposal that take place at disproportionate cost to the well-being and futures of marginalised people, contested spaces, invaded lands. Theoretical and philosophical frameworks such as new materialism emphasise how matter actively contributes to and shapes environments, communities and politics. Significant within my practice is a really personal consideration and careful attention given to Indigenous knowledge that informs relationships with matter and the agency of things. Framed by the critical urgency of adaptation to future life in the Anthropocene, it's contingent on designers, makers and artists to reconsider their relationship between material, technology, and ecosystem. In considering these preferable futures, an emerging scholarship of thought directs our attention beyond the Anthropocene to consider instead Escobar's definition of a pluriverse, a reconstituted world that prioritizes conception of ecologies of practice across heterogeneously entangled worlds. My research practice questions how matter and, in turn, design have been colonized through industrialized concepts of matter as resource to be commoditized, extracted, consumed, exploited, and ultimately discarded. This places emphasis on understanding how divergent knowledges and practices make worlds. The approach through making within my research creation is centered really closely on collaboration with the sociocultural, material, technical, embedded, embodied dimensions of matter to activate new forms, structures, and surfaces. In doing so, my practice recognizes Indigenous understandings of ecosystem, centralizing and honoring bodies of land and bodies of water as lively matter, as ancestor, as vital, and as precious. Prioritizing nature and interrelationship with people rather than as inert resource, this draws on perspectives and methods across textiles, art, technology, ecology, and of course, Indigenous ontologies to develop interactive surfaces and mediated material. Through this, I aim to speak to the problematics of conflicted entanglement of materiality, design, and unsustainability. The conceptual framing is that humanity's perseverance in the coming centuries will require collaboration, explained by Linda Tuhuwai-Smith as being collaboration with agents such as animals, vegetable, fungal, viral, mineral, and digital, beyond those previously classified as human. Through research creation projects, I propose ontological understandings of materials as kin, and in exploring and developing materials and artworks and structural forms, I'm designing them for varying horizons of time, multiple levels of scale, positioning materials as a bridge between disciplines, developing deep ontological understandings of the materials themselves as kin, and working with the stories and histories, intertwining people, plants, places. This engages with the public through emphasizing an alternate relationship with ecosystem where humans are intertwined. As a really highly situated and deeply collaborative process, this research is ethically, methodologically, and aesthetically distinct, being informed by these theories of posthumanism, decolonization, and Ta'ao Māori perspectives, the Māori world perspectives. This project develops through dynamic relationships with human and non-human agents, place and matter. I've hoped that tracing the ontological pathways and ruptures across the layers and fissures of the project lead to discoveries of relationship, behavior, and change through the matter flows themselves. The ethical grounding is based in reciprocity rather than extraction and is informed on and builds on my early approaches, which were centered around ecological collaboration between human and non-human ways of being. The materials from place, when I work with them, are assessed and mapped according to ontological framework and then developed into sculptural works, textiles or surfaces, etc., with scaffolds and structural forms created as a base layer and complex and remediated surfaces. Different digital artworks are visualizing the layered strata of information, the character and the relationships of these materials are also produced. My own personal relationship with matter as a co-creator has really changed over time, and adjusting myself to the shifts in temporality, aesthetics, and outcomes has led me to a deeper appreciation of matter and the life world that we exist within. It's also given me an enriched understanding of materiality. This really didn't happen overnight. There were lots of little lessons and field research from sensing, noticing, observing and witnessing behaviours, interactions, and coming to know my material collaborators. This resulted in this coming into relationality and the relationship with the more than human. I was thinking about how I notice these shifts within myself as a researcher. I see how I am changed by my more than human collaborators, and I consider myself privileged to enter into their worlds, to question my own anthropocentrism and place within the ecosystem. So many of us here today, and many in the exhibition Ecosystems of Hope as part of the artistic programming, work with and respond to ecology and environment through bioart, biodesign, biocomposite materials, or artistic work that engages with thematics. So in exploring and expressing through art, design and research the interlinking of people, place and thing. So today my intervention examines an approach centred on making with, to argue for an expanded notion of more than human material ecologies, and to propose a framework of 4 lenses to consider in working with ecological matter and with the more than human material ecologies. The first and foremost lens in my framework is acknowledgement. For me, this involves first establishing my own personal situatedness to the matter and the ecosystem I'm wanting to approach. I think about whose territory is it? What is the matter here? Is it my place to work with things here? Is it appropriate and culturally safe for me to encounter through research the matter of this place? Are there other issues around land stewardship, kaitiakitanga, Indigenous care of land and place, or resource management that I should be aware of? Who are the communities? Can I consult with them? How can I contribute positively with minimal impact? Or ideally, how can I contribute to care? This begins a really complex and layered process of gathering information about place before I evaluate whether I can work or not with matter here. The process of collaboration then perhaps unfolds. For one project, Phenomenal Dress was part of my postdoctoral research with a human co-researcher, Francis Joseph. It's a customary ban placed over an area to take care of it in a time of either crisis or threat or scarcity. So this customary ban was placed on the kauri forests of the Waitakere Ranges. This is a really remote west coast coastal area in the North Island of Aotearoa. The ban was initiated by the local iwi, the local tribe, who hold customary tribal authority for care of the area. That's Te Kaoro Amaki. The ban on walking in forest parks was implemented to curtail the spread of a really deadly, super fast, soil-borne pathogen called kauri dieback disease, and it was spread by foot traffic and threatened the existence of this mighty tree. You can see 3 of them on the right here. The tree in my culture is both an ancestor and it's also a cornerstone species. So the threat to that tree implicated a whole bunch of other changes. During the course of my 2-year research based in this area, I lived in the kauri forest and I travelled through the forest to access the beach ecosystem. I found myself involved in supporting the iwi, Te Kaoro Amaki, doing volunteer work, placing signs, checking tracks and barriers and reporting on them. And also supporting and helping to implement public education programs. And all this became sort of ad hoc, interwoven into my research project in support of Te Kaoro Maki, the local iwi whose territory both the beach and the forest ranges fell under. Although my research creation focused on the beach ecosystem, I came to understand more about the relationality between this precious place and the surrounding forest through this interaction and activism of kaitiakitanga. I was also fortunate to learn much more about the local iwi and tribal history of this area. And although I didn't realize it at the time, on reflection, I see these actions as pivotal in involving me in care of place. Inadvertently, through circumstance, my process shifted from thinking, how could I work with materials from this place, to instead using my physicality to contribute to protection of the trees and ecosystem. There were many long, slow hours spent walking remote tracks to check fences and signage. And during this, I noticed a gradual internal shift where I was noticing closer and differently because I was looking for spread of the dieback on the trees. In hindsight, I see how this process led me into a new state of becoming worth as a researcher, to situate care for place as being a valid framing in the academic context even of my research. So material futures are inextricably linked to ecological well-being. Through engaging with material innovation, my research responds to the thematics of design unsustainability, colonization and extraction cultures, through formulating a protocol of making with based on collaboration with other species, developing reciprocal and living materials and thinking what that could be, by applying an understanding of the interconnections of cultural, social, political, economic and natural systems, I'm hoping to highlight and amplify the mitigating potential of making with as one alternative to address the mindsets that shape the imbalances of biodiversity loss, environmental degradation and climate change. So this formalization and materialization of post-colonial objects and artifacts involves a lot of embodied knowledge, reflexivity as a researcher, intuition and emotion. This draws our attention to matters of care and the framing of what De La Bellacasa defines as a speculative ethics in collaboration with more than human worlds. This ethics of care, I believe, is demanded and required for relational practice of living and designing with other beings and requires other tool sets besides those of theoretical reflection. This particular approach and attention to materiality involves ecological literacy, and my practice draws from tikanga, or protocols of Mataranga Māori, to engage with matter from a co-creation perspective. So in this, I propose acknowledgement of territory, of an ethics of care, as central in entering into the co-creation with matter, asking what can I learn of the sociocultural politics and histories of things, foregrounds, what is the relationality and kinship here? The second framework for reconsideration in ecological research creation is temporality, or our conception of relationship with time. This is altered and affected by working, of course, with the flux, the ebb, the flow, the rhythms and life cycles of natural materials and phenomenal nature. It's altered and shaped by our understandings of the ancestral connections and lineages of things, the stretch across time of plants and places, through histories of use of medicine and direct descendants as part of an interconnected family. Through this lens of working with, learning with, making with matter is durational, temporal, ancestral, time-based, seasonal, localized, and variable, we encounter a new life cycle of things. We have to adapt and change our modality in working as the time is truly led by the more than human collaborator. And I'm sure that the frustration of attempting to scale this to human time is shared by many. I'll start with the past, as one does, to illustrate something of the temporal scales of ecosystems. There is a seascape, a landscape, and a mindscape that has informed and constituted the legacies of language, the storyings of people, and the understandings of human endeavour and survival that is written into the veins of what we now know as mataranga, or knowledge. Nana Bush took a trip around the world as a way of saying, as a way of learning about the world. That's the first lesson. If you want to learn about something, you need to take your body. In these two quotes, Māori scholar Linda Tuhuwai-Smith and Anishinaabe activist and scholar Leanne Betesamagage Simpson share with us perceptions from two different First Nations of the perspective and the speciality of embodied experience, the inheritance of resilience. In doing so, they draw our attention towards the deep interrelation between land, place, and people, and how this essentially forms knowledge. In Indigenous cultures, the landscape is more than simply a vessel or container for human history. It is the mind of reality shaping the stories of time and space. The proportions of events and the meanings of the ecological relationships between humans, animals, plants, and geologic forms are undivided from the physical experience of, as many elders put it, being on the land. What is the resonance of connection to place, to land and territory? Do you have a place in your mind's eye that allows your soul to experience infinity, to expand? For me, it's the horizon line of Pikifara, the Moko, the mountain, and my direct family line. My grandparents kept returning there long after it passed hands and was lost and sold. It resonates in our psyche to this day. Recently, my dad, who hasn't lived in Aotearoa for many, many years, and I exchanged a really similar recurrent dream, perhaps a memory of being there, of the infinite skies, the horizon fading out into unseen Antarctica, the expanse, the wildness, the sense of nothingness and everythingness, just the albatrosses in the horizon line. This place for us is embodied, literally with the bones of our family, and as itself, the mountain as an ancestor. I worked closely with this mountain, Pikifara, in creating these works for the Smithsonian for a culture lab. I was drawing the contours over and over, tracing the forms of the land. I then tracked the body of a dancer in motion capture and applied the mountain's forms onto the dynamics of the dancer's body. Through this process of close scrutiny, of being with, of becoming, I was struck by the connections to the past. There was this real sense of zooming in and zooming out of memory and history, the micro and the macro, the rising and the setting, the scale of time compressing and expanding through the study of embodied space. Throughout my process of making with, I think about agency as being co-constituted and emerging from these changing relationships between human and non-human things. Matter, to me, is recognized as having its own histories and narratives, and bodies can be individual, they can be ancestral, they can be incorporated entities, and place as having intertwined material and spiritual dimensions. The intention of thinking through this practice is to develop new resilient methodologies for material futures and working on practices of knowing and getting to know the world around us. My job is always super future focused. My job title even reflects this, being an assistant professor of material futures. Yet, in my process, I always start with the past, the stories that connect me back to a place, that connect me to materials through experiential or embodied knowledge. My projects explore new artistic methods of transferring knowledge about resilience, of thinking through this construct represents positive adaptation despite adversity, and examining the connection to place of Indigenous peoples despite continued occupation of colonised lands, and looking at the persistence of plant species and their own tenacity. The third lens I propose for re-examining co-creation and collaboration with ecosystem is aesthetics. It's linked to and reflects the temporal nature of things. I found that my sense of and appreciation of aesthetics, what I valued and sought through the making, was ultimately directed and driven by the agency of matter. From working in digital media for many years, I was accustomed to being able to control the minutiae of elements, to be able to cut, paste, replicate, smooth, render, anything. In earlier projects, I found I was trying to still impose some type of an outcome, a polished form, which I ultimately had to surrender to in working in co-creation through more than human material ecologies approach. Instead, the aesthetics are prompted by the potentiality of the matter, by tracing the encoded layers that form matter flows. These histories and cultures allow me to come to know the matter on another level, but they also prompt a reshift of artistic values. So directed by the life cycles, working in this way is really affected by seasons, locations, soil, health, growth, etc. The aesthetics are driven by the organism. To work with this, care, from my first framework, must be centralized or nourish in order to continue to co-host life through providing a desirable state. This is literally slow design at its slowest. The materials from place, once assessed and mapped according to ontological framework, are then developed into sculptural artworks with sculptural scaffolds and structural forms created using textile methods as a base layer. Different digital methods are also developed, but these works do not easily slot into prearranged timescales of exhibitions or when you intend or hope that the work will be finished by. This shift in aesthetic values reflects slow design principles. Things take time. The research creation work is durational. When I work, for instance, in developing pigments or eco-dyeing from plants, results are soft, faded, often undramatic. The colours also shift over time. They gradually cure and fix, only to shift again later. Variation is the only constant. Growing sea salt crystal forms takes months and is really dependent on ambient temperature and conditions. In this processes, there's a lot of surrendering to change and change being accepted as the aesthetic. Wherever possible, I try to do these processes in situ so that the co-creation invites and provides for symbiotic interchange. But those results too are of course super variable. For instance, when birds peck at your cloth, which you're growing lichen onto. Aesthetics are driven by the organism, the life cycle and the ecosystem, including the expected or hoped for results like growth, reformation. I do a lot of remediation of materials, coloration, propagation, but also other life cycle aspects such as contamination, decay, rot, mold, and other types of entanglements. So working in place with human performers, artistic works develop from phenomena of place, like wind, sun, tides, temperatures, actually direct and control the outcomes. There are a different set of aesthetic appreciation brought into the understanding. So conceptually, these aesthetics invite us into a different value system of ways of knowing. And I'm thinking, how can academic research creation encompass this expanded notion of aesthetics, where variation, mutability, change, perception, palpability, resilience are highlighted by values driven by and expressed through the co-creation. Finally, one more, yet not definitive lens in the framework of making with and co-creating is outcomes. Outcomes is considered here across a number of levels. A central outcome is an examination of the ecosystem of your research itself. Built into the acknowledgement phase of framework is the question of who does this affect? This implicates ecosystemic design of the research. Ultimately, how does this benefit the environment? How does it benefit community? What can I give in return? Do other species even need us? Do we nourish them in return? Do we share nutrients? How can we be beneficial or co-beneficial? So outcomes of dichotic failure-success need to be re-evaluated. Often the breakpoints, the failures in working with matter and place, point to gaps in knowledge or process, and I question whether the real point of the artwork, object, artifact is the process itself. As a pivotal shift in my own co-creation, I now conceive strongly of reciprocity rather than material artifacts as the most significant outcome. Rosaic et al. Recognize that showing respect for the earth, of reciprocity and the importance of observation and attentiveness in learning as knowledge is transmitted through kinship relationships. As a highly situated and collaborated process, this research is ethically and methodologically distinct. Through allowing the making with to take the lead in the process, through developing through dynamic relationship and interchange between human and non-human agents, matter and place. I hope that tracing the ontological pathways and ruptures across the layers and fissures, the cracks in the project, lead to discoveries of relationship of behaviour and of change. The ethical grounding based on reciprocity rather than extraction is informed by ecological collaboration. So rethinking these four framework facets of acknowledgement, of temporality, of aesthetics and outcomes while working with materiality has shifted my process into one driven by and through the co-creation, allowing and following the agency of matter to unfold, following the cues and the potentiality it shares with me. Methodologically, the project involves a process of making with. Through this recognition of matter as history and narrative, we appreciate place as having intertwined material and spiritual dimensions. My hope is through developing these new practices of knowing and getting to know the world around us, that we are allowing ourselves to be shaped by this process too. That co-creation leads to forming new understandings, new knowledge, and value of place, species, and matter that we can in turn share. That through these processes we can address some things around human exceptionalism, assuage some of our very humanistic senses of solastalgia and eco-grief, perhaps even find new ways to coexist. So these approaches explore ontological understandings of materials as kin. Today, my intervention examines this approach centered on making with to argue for an expanded notion of more than human material ecologies and proposing a framework of four lenses to consider and working with ecological matter. Collaboration with the more than human asks us to completely rewrite our approach to research creation. True survival of species, of ecosystem, depends not just on fight, but perhaps also on surrender, on letting go of the idea of human exceptionalism, of seeing the infinite expanse, of resituating and arguing for ourselves as social, nourishing, sharing, co-beneficial species, and recognizing our ecosystemic interdependency and reciprocal existence. Thank you. Go back.
Yeah, Q&A?
I'm done.
Yay! One more time, Miranda Smitheram, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. We have time for a few questions. On a le temps pour quelques questions. Est-ce que quelqu'un a quelque chose qu'ils aimeraient poser? Anyone? Questions, comments? Going once? Are you sure? Anyone? Okay. Well, thank you, Miranda.
Thank you.
It was lovely.
Okay.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Miranda Smitheram, pour la présentation. Nous allons prendre une pause d'environ 10 minutes et nous allons revenir avec les prix reconnaissance jeunesse. Alors, n'allez pas trop loin. On vous invite à revenir dans la salle après votre petite pause ou rester, évidemment, si vous le souhaitez. Et on se retrouve pour les prix reconnaissance jeunesse. Merci. À tout de suite.